Welcome, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. It's great, as always, to see you on the NSE. Thank you for joining us. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 943rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Miguel Abreu and Raphael Rubinstein. We are also thrilled to welcome poet David Blair here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the soul and land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Miguel Abreu was born in New York City and grew up in Paris. He established his namesake gallery in 2006 to nurture and promote what Abreu describes as conceptually challenging and plastically realized works of art. In 2010, he co-founded Sequence Press, a publishing enterprise focusing on contemporary philosophy and the arts. And our host today, Raphael Rubinstein, is the author of many publications, most recently Negative Work, The Turn to Provisionality in Contemporary Art. Curatorial projects include most recently Schema, World as Diagram with Heather Bause Rubinstein. His poems have appeared in several anthologies, including Best American Poetry 2015. A contributing editor of art in America and an editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail. He is also a professor of critical studies at the University of Houston School of Art. Raphael and Miguel, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you, Raphael.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thanks everyone who's here, and looking forward to David's reading at the end. And Miguel, I would like to really start not at the beginning, but before the beginning, before you opened your gallery. And one of the reasons I want to start there is I think you're like, I mean, how does one become an art dealer? How does one decide to open a gallery? Like there are, many different paths, but I think your path is not a typical one in that I don't recall you ever working for another gallery. And you, when I first met you some decades ago, you were involved in the experimental film world, I think, and you had studied film at CalArts.
Mm-hmm.
And I just noticed that you had studied, one of your teachers there was Tom Anderson, the great filmmaker who made Los Angeles Plays itself and a lot of other interesting experimental films. But I guess what I wonder is that, could you talk about just that, the how you came from making films, from having been trained in cinema, and how you found yourself deciding to open a gallery, as Eleanor said, in 2006 on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was really kind of by default that I opened the gallery, because I wanted to continue making films, but I just, it became economically unfeasible. But before I did that, I was also involved in, first of all, I worked in a gallery in New Orleans, but it was a 19th century gallery, 19th century art gallery in New Orleans from 85 to 87. So I had a little bit of experience working in a gallery. It's very different than contemporary art gallery. And then, I had also co-founded with Tim Nye this organization called Thread Waxing Space, which was in Soho in 1990. And it was in operation for 10 years. So I had some background experience that way, but it's true. I didn't work except for that 19th century gallery. I hadn't worked for any other gallery per se. I had done some private dealing when I was living in Paris and also a little bit in New York. But yeah, so that's, and yeah, the way, so a lot of the reason, I mean, that I had the confidence to do this is that when I was at CalArts, I had curated a few shows before in New York in the 1988, 1989, in sort of pop-up places, or, you know, not in actual galleries, but in spaces that we would rent. You know, when I was at CalArts, you know, it's a place where you have art, cinema, theater. I met a number of artists there who I developed substantial dialogues with, and those were the people that I really started the gallery with. So, yeah, these were the background conditions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think that's been distinctive about your gallery from the very beginning is that you have had a really clear idea of what, for you, what does it mean? What is a gallery? And it clearly is much more than a space to show works of art and sell them and have them be written about and give artists space to work. I think that there was a quote that you had wanted to share from the Polish modernist.
Yeah, from Szymiński. I'll read it. I thought it might be a nice way to set the stage. And it's a quote from a letter from Władysław Szymiński, the Polish avant-garde artist, to poet Julian Przyboś in 1929. And he says, "It is not enough to create a good work of art. It is also necessary to create the appropriate conditions for it to exert influence." And I was thinking that's maybe a good definition of what I think a gallery can attempt to do. Create those conditions for the work to produce its effects, you know, on its own terms, as potently as possible. But, you know, to elaborate a little bit on what you were saying, I've always, because of my background in film and editing, I've always thought of programming a gallery a little bit like editing a film. You know, we try to put things in front of each other before and after, and try to see how a cut can be made that can be mutually beneficial to what happened before and what might happen later. So that's the pleasure for me of programming, is to try to identify these artists, these shows. They're not photograms, right? But you want to place them in a sequence that they can benefit from what happens before and after. And so it's not just, you know, doing one show after another. It's thinking about what else can we do to encourage and nurture the work, you know, like, so we've done many things like, well, a lot of other galleries do that as well. But, you know, we started publishing books. So we did launches of book launches, we did talks, we showed films, and always with this idea of where to place it in the sequence, you know, in order to maximize the effects of the continuum of the programming. Yeah.
Well, the continuum, from the one continuum is your experience of film going directly into the first show you did, which was focused around the films of Jean-Marie Straub and Danielle Guillet. And so that was, I guess, your inaugural show in 2006.
I mean, I actually started the gallery because of them, right? I mean,
could you just describe them briefly?
Yeah. I mean, these are filmmakers that I discovered actually when I was at CalArts through Tom Anderson, who is a big fan and aficionado of their work, and he showed us their films, and it took me a while to interiorize them in some way. These are films that are very tough. They're like walls that push you back until they actually let you in, and then really can produce a big impact. And this is what they did over many years. And so, you know, for me, they were kind of examples of how you could produce culture in a positive way. It was all, what they do is adapt pre-existing texts, you know, what they consider important canonical texts from Western history, and service them through adapting them into films. And so, you know, I felt their films were so essential for me in the way I felt and thought about things, and the way they delineated this kind of lineage of cultural objects that they would adapt and you know, service with great care and great sensitivity. So I decided that it would be a great way to start the gallery would be to kind of show their films, which you couldn't really see much at all. Not that it's impossible to see them, but at the time it was, you know, they didn't accept videos. Everything had to be showed on the proper 35 millimeter or 60 millimeter projection format. So I just wrote them a letter, and they received the letter in Paris and responded. And so I went to see them, and I had a very crucial meeting with them and asked them whether they would agree for me to, you know, show their films basically in the street, you know, with 35 millimeter portable projectors. And so we showed, you know, The Death of Empedocles, which is a film by, it's the text by Hölderlin, the prose poem from 1797. And it's about Empedocles, 450 BC. And then, you know, it's a film adaptation which was made in the 80s. So right there was an integrated, you know, sort of homage to certain kinds of cultural objects and text that I was very, you know, very much in tune with. The second film we showed was a kind of documentary or essay film on Cézanne, the French painter. And so that was another film which stages, text by Joachim Gasquet, who is a French poet who wrote these imaginary or somewhat imaginary dialogues with Cézanne. And, you know, the Strauss are huge fans of Cézanne. They made 2 films on Cézanne. I'm a huge fan of Cézanne too. So there was another cultural objects that I could place in this kind of show. And then the third element of the show was to ask an artist to react to this idea of Charbonnier and showing their films. And I asked Blake Rain, who's a student at CalArts that I developed a friendship with, to react to these paintings, to these films or to the work of Charbonnier, and he made a series of paintings. So that was another layer of integration, let's say. He made some great paintings, I thought. And then I published a text, with a pre-existing text by Dominique Pagny on Charbonnier, and that was the show. So it was 2 films, 6 paintings, and 2 texts. And it was just to show or to present to whatever the audience might be, the kinds of things that I admire, and how they would also contribute to influencing the work of a young artist who would make paintings based on this proposition. So
when you say you showed the films in the street, do you mean literally projecting?
No, they were they were in the gallery, but the gallery is very close to the street, so you could hear the outside, noise of cars, and of course the projectors, broke the film several times. It was quite raw, the whole projection, but a lot of people showed up, and it was really very enjoyable and life affirming show, and I was able to basically show what I liked and offer it to my friends and propose some kind of way of reading history and adapting history, and most importantly, just the way the Charbonnier, how they work, is really through adaptation and in very intense adaptation of pre-existing material, you know. And so it's a kind of an ethic of making art that I wanted to endorse and try to just do my part, you know, and extending the lineage. And so, yeah.
That was a moment when there was an emerging gallery scene, I guess you could call it, on the Lower East Side and in Chinatown specifically. I think about Orchard Gallery and Rena Spallings, both of which opened pretty much the same time as your gallery. And were you, I mean, certainly there are artists involved with Orchard who you have shown, most notably, I guess, R.H. Quaitman. But were you aware of people doing different, like trying to find another way of thinking, rethinking what a gallery could be?
Right. I mean, you know, I knew some of the artists that were part of the group that ran Orchard, which was a 3-year project. They had a, moment where they knew they would dismantle or stop. But for me, it was just, you know, I was looking at Chelsea, and there was like 500 galleries there, and I was thinking one of the most important things would be not to just add one more, you know, and to try to find a different place where you could maybe start something that felt different, you know, or that didn't just add to the department store, you know. So, you know, there was Rena Spallings and there was Orchard. Macaron was also there, and I just felt like, okay, well, this is, you know, let's start something here, you know. And I felt very comfortable with the people running Orchard, and I was interested in what Rena Spallings was doing, and so yeah, it just became an easy decision. I felt there was a big risk to take, and it would work or not, you know, but at least it was a different atmosphere that we were trying to activate, you know, and a different mode of maybe thinking and maybe also showing work, you know. And it was very, it became a very active area and environment where we all knew each other, and it was very good, very quickly.
I think there's with some galleries, with some like historic galleries, there's an educational element to, and I think it was Leo Castelli who said at one point that what he had to do, like there really wasn't an audience or certainly not like a collector base for what he was doing in the early 60s. And he had to basically create, like, one of the things the gallery does is kind of create its own public, its own environment. And there are obviously a lot of different ways to do that. But one thing that has really struck me over the years with the artists that you show, many of them, their work has a lot of hidden layers and a lot of, sorry. Thank you, Eleanor, for starting that slideshow. So a lot of I think there's like, one thing is the cross references from different mediums. I feel like a lot of the work, there's a triangulation in your program between photography and film and painting. And I think many of the artists that you work with, like there are a lot of artists using photography, but somehow referencing painting and vice versa, paintings that reference photography, but not in a, not paintings referencing photography in like a Gerhard Richterian kind of way. It's a much more conceptual. And I think that I certainly have many times come into your gallery, and as you can see, I think there in many of the shows, there's a kind of austerity and a challenge to the viewer to figure out what's going on. Why was this made the way it was? Why is it exhibited in this particular way. There's like, I guess what I'm saying is that it really seems that you have, it's not just a matter of, this is not a matter of taste, but it's really a matter of like your concept of what the work of art, or what an interesting, viable contemporary work of art is. And that, I think that certainly can make it difficult, because I feel like, and maybe this is one of the reasons why you have this sort of holistic program of publishing and talks by philosophers, and this, in order to help the audience to unpack this very multi-layered, complex work. I don't know if there's a question in there, but it's more just an observation. And I think that, so what we're looking at here is this is your original space, on Orchard Street, and this is a show of Blake Grain, I think.
Blake Grain, yeah. Folder and Application is the name of the show. And yeah, I mean, literally the words folder and application, have different meanings, including in digital media, a folder. But then he also literally folds things onto the canvas. It's, a lot of wordplay and material play as well, coming from this idea of the title, folding and applying, folder and application. This is the sorry, we moved to the that's the wrong caption. This is actually the first show you discussed earlier, the Charbrier and Blake Grain. That was much earlier, 2006. So it's the wrong caption, but that's the one we first described, with the two films and the paintings and the text by Penny and the paintings by Blake Grain.
This is another, so there's also, well, anyway, we can come back to that question that was not quite a question, but also a wonderful variety of different kinds of uses of the space. This is one of your book week projects, which I guess the one that really that really struck me, I mean, they all did, but there's one, it might be the next slide, focused on the San Francisco Renaissance, the poetic Renaissance in the 40s and 50s. And how did you, is this, how do you see this, how do you see these book week projects relating to
well, I mean,
these,
this was
the idea come from, I guess.
It was a friend of ours who curated this, and I don't even remember who it was, but they had this wonderful collection of San Francisco Renaissance poetry books, so that was a focus. Yeah, I mean, it's just a way, to regroup and propose something different between shows, and to have a chance to turn the gallery into a bookstore. It is a bookstore also. There is a kind of a bookstore in the front of the small space at Orchard Street. There's one also at Eldridge Street. But these book weeks we do with Catherine Pickard, and it's just when we have 2 weeks, we want to do something different. So we propose, ask people to propose a theme for books, to bring them together, and then we display them, sell them, discuss them. It feels always very nice to have this interruption or this kind of moment to regroup through presenting books,
Yeah, rather than having to constantly be mounting another show, then have time to think about it. That makes a lot of sense. And it also,
and as publishers, we like to do that also, right? It's like it's part of what we do. So we like to find enough time for people to pay attention or to have a chance to consider, the books that we publish. Again, with Catherine Pickard and our collaborator in England.
One of the books you published, I think one of the first ones was a book by François
François
Laroque.
Laruelle, yes.
And that I would love to hear you talk about his ideas and his influence on you. But before doing that, I just want to say, and I know how important Laruelle's ideas are to everything you do, and I am kind of hard pressed to think of another gallery in New York that has a sort of resident philosophical spirit. It's like the sort of the house spirit of Miguel Abreu Gallery is this French philosopher, François Laruelle. Could you
well, I mean,
could you just briefly say
yes,
what it is that made it important for you to connect to his work and make it available, and how it might have framed what you do?
Yeah. And by the way, we also show sculpture. This is a show by Jean-Luc Moulin. He's a very important part of the gallery program, a brilliant object maker from France. Yeah, but to go back to Laruelle, I mean, this is a philosopher that I was very fortunate and had the privilege to listen to in a series of seminars he gave in Paris in the mid-'80s at the Collège International de Philosophie, which is a wonderful institution that Derrida and others started, where they invited major thinkers to propose or to conduct seminars open to the public. And I just fell upon it and was introduced to Laruelle's work, and it had a big influence on me. It was at the time I was like 22, 23, a bit unsure what to do next. And this was a real jolt and exciting moment to meet this which I didn't even meet him. I was just listening to him and to his friends and to this whole group of people around his work. And then I lost touch with him, and just by chance, 25 years later or 20 years later, a friend of ours and the people at Urbanomic, I just realized were reading him and translating him into English. To make a long story short, we got in touch with each other, and that's how we established the collaboration, the publishing collaboration, is through Laruelle, who I had followed and studied with, and the fact that they were interested, Robin Mackay, in his work. And so, yeah, that was how we started. And then the next book and the next book, and I kept going. And he came to New York, and we had a whole seminar with him. It was wonderful. A few days, many people came, and his work became translated quite a lot in this country in English. And so we were part of, for me, it was wonderful to go back to somebody who had influenced me and was able to and contribute to his exposure to English language readers. And so I think it had a big impact on his reception. Because he was just a professor, at Nanterre in Paris, and then he became this widely translated author. So that was a nice example of what we could do. And a lot of artists were reading his, that I work with, were reading this text, The Concept of Non-Photography, a difficult but fascinating short essay. So that was again part of the flow of the program.
And I know Alain Badiou, you've also posted him a number of times. And
Badiou, major thinker. Also had a big...
like the gallery is, in some ways, it's a cultural center.
Well, I mean, hopefully
a for-profit cultural center.
Yes. I mean, yes, that was we were very privileged to be able to do things like this. And the economic proposition is always, very, very sensitive thing to establish. To find a way to make all this work and making an economically viable proposition. It was very experimental. But I do believe that art is at its best when it produces its own economy, and it becomes more palpable as a force than if it just exists in just a market that pre-existed to prominent.
Miguel, sorry, what do you mean by when when the art creates its own economy?
Well, I mean that what I mean is that every time we put up a show, that's the way it was then, it's still today. The show has to produce its own economic effects, its own results. It's we don't have anything that you don't have the funding, that could just guarantee we could do anything we want, right? So we just have to navigate the economic proposition. And so, when you think about putting up a show, when you think about nurturing a work of art or an artist's work, you have to think about what kind of economy can support it, right, within the gallery, and to forward our capacity to keep going. And for us at the beginning, for many years, and we were lucky enough that we never had to pick up our phones to make a sale. The program was bringing people in that seemed to be interested, and it was enough to sell enough work to not have to become just a marketing operation. It was marketing in a different sense. And so, yeah, that was a privilege, and so it allowed us to keep focusing on basically programming and trying to do the best shows we could. But again, this idea of editing, I want to go back to it maybe a little bit, because I sometimes, when I'm asked about this idea of how do I really do things, and I use this metaphor of film and sequencing, I always thought that Robert Bresson's idea of montage in his book on cinematography, it was always for me a leading way of thinking. I mean, he helped me to think really how to do things. And basically, what he says is that when you edit films, each shot has to be, first of all, partial. It can never be an establishing shot where you see everything at once. And why is that? It's because when you do an establishing shot, there's nothing to cut to. Everything's there, right? And his idea is that a shot should be partial, which means that it should be about not a full, total proposition, view, image. It has to be about something which is only a part of an image in order to generate a need for another image, right? And the sensitivity of the cut is to find a way to reduce the shot to basically one thing, one thing that has as much sensitive quality that it gets to the point where it needs something else. So in Bresson, the cut is just about that. It's like, rendering the partial shot as sensitive as possible so it can end up being reduced to one element, whether it's a word or gesture or look, that actually feels like it needs something else. And in that sense, generates the cut. And the next shot has to then look back and take on that charge. So for me, that's how I think about programming, right? It's to try to reduce things to the cut, and the cut becomes then an act of love, right? In Bresson's idea, something is sensitized to the hilt, a partial object, a partial shot, in order to want something else, need something else, and that cut becomes an act of love.
That, I think, helps to understand also why my impression is that you've been very patient and careful about bringing new artists into the gallery. I think you started with a small group of artists, more or less your generation, and who had not shown very much, plus people like the Straubs and Jean-Luc Moulin. And then I think
most of these artists had already shown, and had careers, but in my opinion, they hadn't been nurtured or presented. the way I do things is always when I engage with an artist, and I always try to think about what is it that I can do, to add or to nurture or to intensify what the artist is doing. How can the gallery do that? And if I don't feel like I have something to add in that sense, something, some kind of angle that would help unpack the work and allow it to produce its own effects. If I don't feel like I have an angle to do this, then it's really not something I get involved with, because I don't then necessarily see what my role can be. So someone like Rebecca Quaitman, she was already well known. She had done many shows, but nobody had really, I don't know, felt the need to try to examine the work carefully and to unleash his powers. So I was immediately very impressed by what I saw when I did a studio visit. And yeah, so then it was a great opportunity to try to present something that had not been shown, even though people knew it, not been shown in that sense.
I think one of the interesting additions to the gallery in the last few years has been Tishan Su.
Mm-hmm.
And which I had remembered his work, as I'm sure other people did who were around in the mid-late 80s in New York. His work hadn't been seen for a long, long time, at least not in New York. And I think that did you, I don't know if you can talk about that or want to say something briefly about how, and right. Here's his work there, we can see.
I mean, he actually, when we did our show, we hadn't had a gallery show in New York for 32 years. But right before we did our show, there had been a kind of survey show organized by Sohram Mohebi at the Sculpture Center at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. But I discovered the work through a show he did in 2018 at Empty Gallery in Hong Kong, where he had developed a series called Delete. And I remember his work from the late 80s, and I had always felt a bit uncomfortable with it, didn't really know what to think of it, but I was interested, and but just had forgotten about it. And then when I saw this new work, it just kind of sparkled into life, and I became very interested in what was going on in this work. And I saw, okay, what a great opportunity to kind of reignite through new work, the career of an important artist who I thought was doing his best work recently. So yeah, it was a very interesting proposition to engage with. And the difficulty there was that when we started, everybody, and the show at the Hammer and at the Sculpture Center was focusing on the 80s works and a little bit on the 90s, but didn't show anything that had been done recently. So when we started, everybody was asking about 80s works. There was this kind of cliche reaction where everybody thought, okay, well, the important work must be the 80s because he disappeared since. And so the challenge was to try to create this kind of continuum and to make the recent work or present it as a force that was as potent as the early work. And it wasn't we didn't know we would succeed, right? It took a while, and then after a couple of shows that we did where we included his work, one was called The Poet Engineers, which is a show we did, a group show we did with a number of other artists. It started to, people stopped asking about the 80s and started to consider the new work as interesting. And so that was a nice moment of, editing the work into being and creating this continuum that affirmed the new work as much as the old work.
Another artist that you've shown who has a long history, and it was a really, I think, unusual choice. And again, bringing something to New York audience that otherwise wouldn't have been seen as your show of Jean-Luc Godard's maquettes for his I guess kind of disastrous Pompidou exhibition from a few years earlier. And this was, I guess, Godard, who died about a year ago.
Mhm.
That, what was that like? I'm, as a massive Godard fan, I'm just really curious to know
Yeah.
what and he's so notoriously difficult. And what were you? What was that like? And also, could you just? I know we have some images, Eleanor. If you could find the Godard maquette images, which are right there.
Yeah.
And,
Oh, I mean, this was an opportunity of a lifetime. Somebody in Europe who had managed to. These were the maquettes that he did for a show he was commissioned to produce for the Pompidou Center in 2006, and they were maquettes of these 9 rooms that he had imagined as a kind of architectural presentation of a history of cinema through architecture, through these different rooms that each had a function. This, the black one here, is called the camera, for example, and it has all these wonderful elements, including little films, clips, quotes. And this is basically a world view through this kind of deambulation, this kind of walk through the space that was allocated to him, divided into 9 rooms. To make a long story short, the show had all kinds of tensions and problems and fights, and these rooms were never realized, so they were kept at the level of maquettes. Some of them were included in the final show, which is this very anarchic presentation of lots of cables. It was a wonderful show in itself. But these maquettes, and I can't describe it too precisely now, but these maquettes were kind of piled up in a column, and at the end of the show, they Pompidou Center had asked if he wanted them back, and they had basically placed a value of €1 million on it, because that was the fee that he had received to make his show. That was in preparation for a number of years. Films were being made, all kinds of things, but that was the price, and there was some customs assessment to bring him back to Switzerland, where Godard lived, and there was an 8% tax. So Godard decided just to kind of donate them to a charitable foundation, I forget which one, and they were sold together in a very kind of haphazard way. And this collector bought them sight unseen. And at some point he called me, because he's also a friend and a fan of the films of Straub and Huillet, and he said, would you be interested in reconstructing and showing them? And I said, of course. So we embarked in this archaeological endeavor, which was a very exciting project. It took a while. We brought him over, had to rebuild a lot of the collages and find the footage that appeared on little iPods that were out of date, the mechanisms. And I worked with the Godard's assistant from the time. Godard didn't want anything to do with it, but we did it, and it was a wonderful opportunity to work with one of the great minds of the 20th century, and to see how he approached producing these worlds and these little rooms. This one says, Dieu est mon droit, God is my right. There's all kinds of...
Certainly, you were talking before about the notion of working with existing materials, and Godard is such at the same time, he's, was incredibly original and inventive and creative, but he was also a kind of mad scholar of the past of painting and history. And this you really get a sense of that
Yeah.
in this work. And
He's the master of the quotes. I mean, everything's a quote in some ways.
And I think that's like, could we do a segue to Rebecca Quaitman's the show with about the Paul Klee print, which was in 2017
or something, or 18. It's there somewhere.
I think, Eleanor, I think there are some
there we go.
images of that.
No, not that one. It's another show, probably further down. Yeah, here we go. At 19. Yeah. So this show was a show we did after an exhibition at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, which had a lot to do with the main motif. Rebecca always finds motifs to have, or imagery or histories that have to do with the space of exhibition. In this case, she's one of the main motifs of the painting sequence, or the chapter, as she calls them, of paintings that she had produced, was analyzing the Angelus Novus, Paul Klee's Angelus Novus, which was in the Israel Museum. It's probably one of the most important artworks in Israel, and she managed to have it, sent to Italy to be scanned, because she had developed an interest in the margin of the Angelus.
Sorry, can I just pause you just for a second to just remind everyone that this is the work that had belonged to Walter Benjamin, and he had written about it famously, and then it was inherited after Benjamin's death by Gershom Scholem, and I assume Scholem donated it to the Israel Museum. Just a footnote there.
Yeah. So it's a very significant work of art. But Rebecca was interested on the paper, or it actually was an etching upon which the Angelus Novus had been affixed, and she had become determined to understand what image was, in that sheet of in that etching, which nobody was interested in, or had any interest in uncovering. So she basically looked at this sheet of, you could see the black margin, and discovered that there were a few indices. Like, you could see that there was a shirt, you could see initials of the person who had etched the image. So there was definitely an image there. The Angelus Novus, by miracle, was allowed to go to Rome. You can see on the top there, top left, is the result of the MRI. You don't see, it remains inconclusive. But so the show at Tel Aviv was all about these paintings that are trying, the subject matter of the time was trying to uncover the nature of the margin. What was that image upon which the Angelus Novus was affixed? To make a long story short, she finally, through many, many hours and many, many days of overlapping image banks or archives of etchings, completely by chance, she found an image that corresponded exactly to the margins around Angelus Novus, and it turned out to be a portrait of Martin Luther by Lucas Cranach. So this whole detective story, which produced a number of paintings, it ended up being a discovery, a major discovery, our historical discovery. And then so she made a series of paintings that we showed following the show in Tel Aviv, where all of a sudden the Lucas Cranach portrait of Luther becomes part of the subject. So that was very interesting to me, for everybody, exhibition.
Fascinating. It was fascinating. There, like the variety, as I in preparing for this NSE, the variety of exhibitions you've done just really struck me, and like things like the show of James Metcalfe's sculptures, this fascinating figure American who had been in Paris after the war and ended up in Mexico, and this is his work, and that was totally unpredictable, unexpected, and that I thought another exhibition that was really also unusual is you did a show of the collection of our old friend Adrian Dannett.
Yeah.
And
James Metcalf show, it was, again, I felt very privileged to show this work, because he was a very interesting sculptor who had basically one of the few artists I can think of who had realized a kind of socio-political utopia as a kind of leftist, as a communist, by using his craft and his knowledge, his great knowledge, great craft of copper and metalsmithing, to basically revive an entire town in Mexico that he had fell in love with, where coppersmiths were producing work, crafts objects, but basically losing the capacity to survive economically. And so he introduced these new techniques and developed this school, and the whole city, through art and crafts, was able to rejuvenate itself as a socioeconomic zone, which became very successful and ended up tragically. That's an old story. But so for me, it was a great opportunity to show work that had actually contributed to a real world, a story, a real world success story, socioeconomic story, and cultural story. And it was an opportunity to show this work, and many of the ideas behind it were, of course, dear to me. And it's a very impressive moment of history that he produced. So it was, the relationship between craft sculptor and then the sculptor who abandons signing his artworks and turns into a teacher and a producer of crafts.
There's so many things so many shows to talk about. There was, you did a solo show of Paul Pag's paintings last year, and Paul Pag is someone I know that you've known and I've known a long time, and I think you maybe had shown him in a group show very early on, and then have come back reconnected with his work. And
well, I've always been in touch with Paul Pag and his work, and this is an interesting case. This is someone who I've known and quietly admired for many, many years. And all of a sudden I felt, okay, this is the time. This is the time to show him, because all of a sudden I felt that his work was really resonating as a kind of counterforce to what was happening, with what is happening today in painting. And so that was about slow rumination and just getting to the point where I felt, okay, this is the moment, and let's try to seize it. And the show was a really wonderful moment for both of us and for everybody who knows him, to all of a sudden see that. And first of all, it was also about following his work in the studio and getting to the point where I felt that there were like 12 or 15 paintings that really formed a compelling group, and that we're going to make a great show. So that's the time. It's never happened to me that I would wait for so long to start working with an artist, and it's a very special relationship I have with Paul. And the show was a very well received and a great success, and it was a pleasure to participate in this new reception.
Hmm. Right, and going back to what you said before, like this
is another great example of someone. The work exists, everybody knows it, but then the key of what we do as a gallery is to find a way to present it in the right way, and to kind of find it's about being sensitive and understanding, and really trying to examine its inner structure, its inner dynamic, and to manifest it as potently as possible. And that also has to do with, when are you going to do this? At what moment? In what context are we operating in? And I think for Paul, it was, I mean, so many people I know who knew his work were just kind of amazed at what they saw, as if they hadn't seen it before. And that was very rewarding. And of course, I asked you to write the text, which you did. And that was another great moment and great part of the show, because you were the perfect person to actually write about it, and you did produce a great text. So yeah, again, it's just about being sensitive, finding the moment, making sure that you understand the work enough so you can allow it to produce its effects, on its own terms.
Right, to have as the Stresminski quote that you began with, the appropriate conditions.
Yeah,
create those appropriate conditions.
Yeah.
Do you we're running I don't want to stop without saying a little bit about what shows up currently on Eldridge Street and the Liz Deschen's work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is what we're looking at. This is actually up at the gallery right now.
That's right, yeah. And this is a show, Liz Deschen's, great artist I've worked with for many years. We're having a show in New York for 5 years. This is a whole new body of work that we had the pleasure of, it's very simple, very fragile, very delicate work. And it's basically these square prints on Gorilla Glass, which is the glass that phones and screens are made of, very thin glass, which are held up in suspension and are of just different colors. So the basic gesture is to render opaque and two-sided the screen that you look at all day long, and to magnify it to a size that that is appropriate. And so what we did with this show, and we had to really think about the installation, and I think we did a very it was a real pleasure. It was a very ambitious project in very precise installation process that we engage with. And basically it duplicates the architecture, suspends it, affirms it, and creates kind of all over space.
And also has an interesting, like that row of suspended works. First image makes me think of the famous Daniel Buren piece he did at John Weber Gallery in the 70s, where almost like a laundry line with his stripes going over West Broadway from the gallery out the window into over West Broadway. And I feel like there's some resonance and some echo of that.
I mean, it's second order abstraction, right? It's not Buren at all in terms of the object and the composition, but it's more, what was really interesting is to see how, without really being aware of it, we ended up reaffirming certain kind of aesthetic values of someone like Mondrian, or it's like Broadway boogie woogie in 3D. And and to look at this kind of work today in the world we live in, with all the catastrophes and horrors that are happening in these different wars, just to see these kind of beautiful and large, like gigantic pixels dancing around. It was, people seem to respond to it. Strangely enough, it's very, very different from what you get to see around, but it's I'm very happy with the proposition, and people seem to feel curiously uplifted by seeing the work and its compositional presentation.
Well, there's nothing better than that. Should we, Eleanor, could we open up the platform for Q&A if there are questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Raphael and Miguel, for that really wonderful conversation. It's been such an honor, such a treat. We do have a bunch of questions from the audience. So our first question today will be from GE, and I will ask on GE's behalf today. GE wrote, can you tell us a bit about Sequence Press and how its mission coincides with the gallery to grow bold new paths of thought, especially in philosophy? Who have you published in philosophy? Thank you.
Oh, thanks for the question. Again, you know, I've always, I mean, we know, you know, since Marcel Duchamp that contemporary art object has an idea component, whether we want it or not, and that maybe the best objects are the ones that incarnate the idea as well as possible. So, you know, for me, it was always a question of, you know, art and ideas are basically the same thing, you know, or they resonate with each other. And, you know, we talk, you know, art is also something that helps us generate conversations about ideas. And so, you know, it was an opportunity to start publishing, which I described earlier, through the work of François Laruelle, this French philosopher. And we met Robin Mackay at the time. And he had already started the publishing house in England called Urbanomic, and he was publishing his magazine called Collapse. And so we realized we had, you know, Catherine Pickett and I, a lot in common and a lot of joint interest. He was a major force already, especially in establishing what became this movement in philosophy called speculative realism, and some of the main texts from that movement were published by Urbanomic and us. And by the way, they became very popular in the art world. Many shows were grounded in speculative realist ideas for many years. And so we were offering the text, and it was just, you know, an opportunity to offer our community, the artists, things to read, you know, and to engage with. But it was always done separately than the shows or the art that we were showing. It was a parallel operation. It still is. And but so things hopefully resonate with the work that we show or not. And it's always a pleasure to sell a book to somebody who's interested in something that has not necessarily much to do with art, but that could be interesting to an artist's development or to a thinker's development.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miguel, and thank you for that question, GE.
But also, you know, the events that we do, sorry, this effect.
No, go ahead.
That when we bring the writers and the philosopher in to launch their books, and they've been some of the most you know, rewarding moments for the gallery. And I think they were always packed, and we've done fewer recently, but we still have a couple in mind that are coming out with 2 new books that we published. And they were just the moments of real joy and exchange and intensity and intellectual high. And I think most people enjoy them a lot. And it was for us an opportunity to kind of give something to the community, you know, that was unusual and, you know, usually very high caliber thinking. So it was really it has been a pleasure to do that, as well as everything else we do. But it's always nice to be able to think of that we do that when, you know, when the art world is not always as interesting as it could be.
Thank you, Miguel. Our next question is from Barbara Rosenthal, and Barbara, you are able to unmute to ask.
That worked. Hi. Okay. Miguel, conceptual, philosophical. You've never in this discussion used the word concept or conceptual, but philosophical quite a few times. As you know something about my work, I've been on this edge for quite some time, and I'd like to hear you just maybe say something if you have any thoughts. These are quick. This is a quick moment on something that you can take years to think about. But if you have any thoughts about conceptual art, versus these more subtle and aesthetic works that you show. I don't want to answer the question that I'm asking, but you might have given this some.
Yeah.
So
well, I mean, again, the most important part of what I'm mostly interested in is the plastically realized component of the quote, right? Is how does an idea produce a well executed object? And usually, for me, a great object is conceptually charged, but it's really about the plastic realization in the end, right? The conceptual apparatus supports it, and I think that the better the idea, the better there's a chance for if the artist is good, to realize the contour of a material object. And so I think for me the sensuous and the plastic reality of the object is in the end what you see and feel. But the best objects usually have the best ideas behind them. That's simple.
Miguel, I think the that show you did called Poetic Engineers or The Poetic Engineer.
The Poet Engineers, yes. Yeah.
Poet Engineers, like that kind of says it in another way, what you're just saying, in response to Barbara's questions, like the engineering, like I think that's something that runs through pretty much all the work you show, that like the intricacy and thoughtfulness and innovation behind the making of the work, the kind of technical aspects, and yet they are they're also, there's a kind of craziness to them as well. So it's this, like, the poetic engineer is
it was a show. Most group shows are about some kind of subject or some theme or whatever, and for me this show was about, okay, it was an opportunity. We had time, by the way, because it was COVID time, to do a show about maybe what I would describe as what are the existential conditions for artists today to produce new forms, right? And so I came up with this idea, the poet and the engineer. Because why engineer? Because we're in a moment where we have new the conditions are very simple: new materials, new fabrication techniques, and what's the third element? New software tools, right? And so these are just like objective tools that are now available to the artist. And it's a kind of, it's not that any of this is actually completely new, but basically new in the sense that, they are liberating from some of the more traditional media that we've had for centuries. And so I thought, okay, this is an opportunity for the artist to invent new forms. So in order to do that, you have to be a little bit interested in the engineering aspect of things, because these are the conditions, right? Now, of course, the key is how do you remain, and how can you make poetry with these new tools, right? So my position is that we're actually in a great moment for art because of these new tools and because of this opportunity that these tools offer to invent new forms. And that's not really what a lot of people are talking about now. Inventing new forms. It's always been, for me, the goal of art in some way. And but I'm still interested in that, and I think it's a very exciting time in a way. And there are some great artists working with these new tools. But not only with these new tools, because someone like Jean-Luc Moulin, who was one of the real inspirations for this show and collaborators in the show, he works with bronze and he works with glass as well as many other things, and 3D tools, software tools. So it's not about, the whole show is about making sure that we're not glorifying technology or the engineer as such, but just seeing what you can do with it. How can you be a poet? And it's an old idea, by the way. It goes back to the avant-garde, right? The poet engineer was already alive in the 20s, 1920s, as a figure, as an ideal or utopian figure. So yeah, so it was a really a great opportunity for me to work for a while and with many people and produce a kind of catalog and about unleashing some of these artists that I've always unveiled the work of some of the artists, some of my favorite artists. Work with someone like Pierogi on his new prototype for a new sculptural project. Work with someone like Mary Bragamian, and many artists that I worked with already, but also Helen Martin, and others.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that question, Barbara, and thanks again, Miguel. Our final question today will be from our publisher, Fong, and just want to say we received a lot of great questions, so thank you all for sending them in. And unfortunately, we are running close on time, so if we didn't get to your question, thank you so much still for sending it. And now over to Fong for the final question.
Thank you, Eleanor. Would you mind sending those questions forth to Miguel later? So maybe he get a chance to answer everybody later. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed some of it from the beginning. Miguel was in the meeting, but it's been always terrific to hear you guys talk. So this is terrific. Yeah, to do anything new, it's not about being new. It's also to do something vital. I think that's always been the struggle of what we do. It's always that perpetual, balance between what oscillate between the profound lamentation of history with its natural tendency to repeat itself. I remember Edward Young, one of my favorite British poet, who say, why is it we born original but die as copies? But then we had the renew, because you talk about the training. I couldn't help but quote Apollinaire, the attitude, avant-gardist attitude, when he say, even if nothing is new under the sun, the new spirit does not refrain from discovering new profundities in all this that is not new under the sun. I think that's exactly, it's not keep things alive, but keep it vital, in my view, So the question is super, Miguel, because I happen to have this right in front of me. The Selected Eyes, the anthology that Rosamond Bernier and her husband, second husband, George, put it together from Le magazine. And we spoke briefly once, but we never quite follow. I think, can you share with us your father's role in it, which I'm sure had a lot to do with your upbringing? That's the question, Miguel.
Well, okay. My father was the publisher of that magazine, which was established in the late 50s, with Georges Bernier, who was a brilliant surrealist, late surrealist, and he was the editor. But some, it was a magazine made by 4 people. We spoke about this with Fong already, and it was really about in the surrealist kind of spirit, it was about finding interesting things to write about and to show, period. Didn't have to, the contemporary art didn't exist as a category. I grew up in Paris when things were just more or less interesting, and or at least then things turned to more militant politics, and that was a different kind of interest in the late 60s and 70s. But before that, late 50s, and I mean, this publication was, about just finding interesting things to write about. It could be Egyptian sculpture, it could be decoration, it could be any objects, whatever struck the fantasy of a writer that Bernier would know, and they would write these wonderful essays or articles. It was the only publication you could find in Jacques Lacan's waiting room. Was one thing.
That's right.
But that was in a way, the confusion of my background, because I didn't know what interesting things were, and then contemporary art showed up, and it became a whole different game. But I think it's nice to remember that contemporary art is an invention. It's not a given. It's and eventually it'll be part of history as a moment that has contour. Maybe you already know what. I always have fun looking at something and say, oh, well, this looks like contemporary art, and I think a lot of people can now say that it looks like contemporary art, which means that we have to go somewhere else, invent something else in contemporary art. Anyway, thanks for the question.
No, it's now that people know. So it's always the fertilizer that has something to do with the growth of the flower. It's quite anti-Lacanian, but not. So thank you, Miguel.
Let's have dinner soon, Fong. Thanks for the invitation.
No, I'm delighted to have the whole story, share with all of our audience here. And I'm sure once we put it on the YouTube, accumulate more viewers. So thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you, Raphael. And making sure that you all go see Lisa's show right now, who's featured interview in this issue. But no more for me. Back to you, Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fong, for that question. And again, a huge thanks to Miguel and Raphael for the wonderful conversation. And thank you so much to the audience. And thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for sending your questions. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, David Blair, to the stage.
Oh.
David Blair was born in New York City and grew up in Pittsburgh. He's the author of 5 books of poetry and a collection of essays. His newest book, True Figures, Selected Shorter Poems and Prose Poems, 1998 to 2021, was just published by Mad Hat Press in October. He lives in Somerville, Massachusetts, and teaches in the MFA writing program at the University of New Hampshire. He's been a Boston poet for the last 25 years. Thank you so much for being here with us today, David.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and I'm very grateful to the Brooklyn Rail. I'm a very happy subscriber of this publication, and I'm looking forward to visiting your gallery, Miguel, next time I'm in New York. Sounds great. Here's a poem. It's not a great museum, for Sebastian Smee. When you drive by, you are glad they are all in there. Some of these wigged out paintings the surviving heirs could not wait to give away to the museum for awful and ugly. Saint Renaissance nonplussed wears a meat cleaver like the matador's cap. Sure, it's old and balanced, yet thanks, you can hang this one at your museum place like Leon Trotsky around some corner to go boo. Then 1001 creepy English choir boys sing their apple cheek heads off in their white freak nightshirts, the mementos of the loons. That's for Sebastian Smee, is a friend of mine from Somerville, and he's the at-large art critic for the Washington Post. He's a great writer. And my sister Christine is here, and she's an artist, actually. And there's a line that I wanted to tell her that I cut from the poem that was, Sister Wendy said no. I think I have slides for the next two poems. And I've been last year I collaborated with my friend Donald Langasee, who's a painter who has MS, who I've known for years. So he still paints, and we went back and forth. He made collages based on my poems, and I made a couple of poems based on some of his collages. It was a lot of fun. Oh, this one up here is Philip Guston in Boston Ode. As talk becomes prose and prose becomes song, poets, mostly including me, especially people who loved Bill Corbett, especially David Rivard, are crazy about Guston interviews. Champion of what to do, Guston, anti-racist. The figure, why not? Use backwards telescope to keep looking at some Giotto, his paintings, a shower on the dullness, desperation, lets ugly in, shows us deeds and lack of faith, and the opposite. People don't know how to look. We all start to moralize ick as much as lick. There is a great realistic painting in the lesser Pittsburgh Frick. Same house in two cities to make darker senior piss trips to head okay for Blind Henry with believable noodles. Spanish peasant glutton digs in, twirls on one implement of eating, a knife. Frick bought it. Earth tones of shaggy clothes. The world turns. The display television playing for display used couches. They reminded me, show business stays a no-show. Too many managers, too many committees, too much fear, too much red tape. Performance, on the other hand, goes there or doesn't. Imagine writing for Jackie Gleason. Imagine Carl Reiner. Imagine they had Guston walk in. You have large toes visible in your sandal. The saints and angels of the frescoes are big as your sectionals. 20 guys did not do the first cave painting. It was just one cave dweller standing there with her bone, his bone, their bone, the brush. And I get the next slide here. This is a paint. This is Donald, after he did a bunch of these, he's like, I want you to do one of mine. So he made this self-portrait of himself as Marcel Duchamp. For Marcel Duchamp by Donald Langasee. Kindly, Donald, I like how you make Marcel look like you. Donald, knowing to live is always to get back to basics, and Duchamp is the basics. Making a face like the yogurt is a disgusting color and tastes too sweet and mediated by something, yet there is caffeine in it, trying to make that artificial sweetener. And because he is you and you love him, he gets to wear that money-colored jacket, also some kinds of golden dried snots that everybody knows are a pleasure to flick into a potted fig or someplace. He could put one polished rock against another polished rock and some empty spool and an emery board the color of Band-Aids. And when we look at it, those stones become eyeballs in a tabletop chicken coop. As for the sad concertina of the urinals people carry under their arms as they join the marching bands of money, he plucks his chicken blandly to show that object is not real just for pee, and that other thing that is you is not a thing. All right, then this is the last poem I'm going to read. It's in the, I don't need a slide for this one. It's in the current print and online edition. The first poem I read is in the online edition of the November issue. For my friend in the X-ray room, the kid tripped. It must be hard to fit some names on a marquee to go with that X-ray. See how many colors that toe is turned and know that toe is broken into some January sunrise. The X-ray room has the metallic cold smell of empty file cabinets that roll shut. This person has a high-powered telescope camera to peer into the universe of the body. Lead aprons feel the way George Jones said the bartender's girlfriend feels, keeping him safe from floating away. Energy gets to be visions of bones, one of the peaks of science. Anybody who has browsed back page ads would have to admit, this is the ad you would submit. Single ass cold against that metal chair at my work in this shady place in my pajama bottoms. Thank you so much, everybody. I really enjoyed being with you here today and hearing everything.
Thank you so much for that reading, David. And be sure to check out David's poems in the November issue. There's a link there in the chat. And a huge, huge thanks again to Miguel and Raphael. Thank you also to Rose and Stephen from Miguel Abreu Gallery for helping us prepare for today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE and making these daily conversations possible, and for supporting our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. For the past 23 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the work we do here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation with Sarah McAnini and Amanda Millett-Sorsa on the event of The World Around, a Mixed Bag at Tibor Dinaj Gallery. We will conclude with a reading by Rachel James. Thank you all so much for tuning in today, and you can now turn your microphones on and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the great questions.
Hello and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
so
Great
much.
conversation.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you,
Thank you,
Raphael.
Miguel.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Raphael.
David.
Thanks, Miguel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice to
Congratulations.
see you again.
Great to
Fawn.
hear you.
Thank you for reading. Beautiful
Thank
reading,
you.
David.
Thank you so much.
David.
Thank you, you
Awesome.
guys. Thank you
Bye,
so much. And
everybody. Happy Thursday, all.
go see the
More
show.
to
Lead the
be-
Shen show, you all.